why do our brains seem wired to focus on the negative, and how is that quietly sabotaging our happiness?
Well, first, I think this negativity bias is here for a reason. So many of our instincts are here for a reason. And in this case, negativity bias probably helped us survive. Human beings are wired to pay more attention to threatening stuff than to positive information, right? So we look more at threatening information than positive information. We remember negative events more than positive ones. We make decisions more based on what we don't want to lose than what we do want to gain. And 200,000 years ago, that was a probably great idea. Life was extraordinarily dangerous compared to what it is now. And you can imagine somebody who was worried about a predator on the horizon would have a better shot of survival than somebody who was blissed out by the sunset on the opposite horizon. So I think that whenever it comes to our instincts, even the ones that are hurting us now, we should honor them. We should thank them for keeping us alive for the last 4 or 5 million years. That said, negativity bias now has run amok. I think this is partially because of the media ecosystem that we are all embedded in that feeds our psychological addictions. And in this case, negativity bias has morphed into cynicism, into a perception that just people are awful and the world is awful, that is completely distorted and separated from the evidence.
What's the difference between cynicism and skepticism?
Yeah, this is a wonderful and important question because I think they often get confused with one another. You know, my job as a research psychologist is to help us be more precise about the language that we use every day to understand ourselves better. Skepticism is a scientific view of the world, right? It's where you don't have assumptions about people, but you wait for evidence. Cynicism is instead a blanket assumption. It's a theory that people in general are selfish, greedy, and dishonest. So you can think of cynics as like lawyers in the prosecution against humanity, right? They have an idea before they meet a person, before they encounter a situation, that this person's going to be selfish, for instance. And they just look for evidence that confirms that suspicion and ignore the other half of the evidence. In that way, cynics actually have a lot in common with the naive and gullible people who they love to make fun of, who assume that everybody's great and ignore evidence to the contrary. Skeptics are more like scientists, again, who don't want to argue for one thing or another, but rather want to learn from the world.
And how does cynicism develop in people?
Well, I mean, it's partially heritable, meaning that there's some genetic component to it.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought.
I know, but it's a pretty weak genetic component. Less than a quarter of people's cynicism can be explained by their genes. I think that more than that, it's the environments in which we're raised and in which we live. So one precursor to cynicism, for instance, is insecure attachment. If you learn very early in your life that you're not safe around the people who are supposed to take care of you, that by extension leads you to feel less safe in the world, more prone to suspicion and mistrust. Another, though, is the environments that we're in as adults. One of my favorite studies took place in southeastern Brazil. There are 2 fishing villages there, separated by about, let's say, 40 miles. One of them is on the ocean. So in order to fish there, you need to get large boats, heavy equipment. You have to work together. It's too dangerous to do on your own. The second village is on a lake, meaning that you can fish alone, and fishermen only connect with one another when they're competing for the best spots. Economists went to both of those villages and measured how trusting and how trustworthy people at each one were. It turns out that when they started their careers, lake and ocean fishermen were pretty similar. But the longer that people spent in a cooperative environment fishing on the ocean, the more they trusted people and the more they were trustworthy as well. The longer that they spent on the lake, the less that they trusted and the more that they betrayed other people. And what to me is really powerful about this is, one, our environments can literally evolve us into different versions of ourselves, but 2, people in both of those villages were right. If you're in a collaborative environment, then trusting others is a wise move that will pay off. If you're in a competitive environment, suspicion is also a wise move that will pay off for you instead.
Interesting. Do you think social media today, because of the way that it tends to segregate us physically, might be playing a role in our collective? I mean, you see statistics all the time about how people are losing trust and becoming more cynical towards government, towards media, and even towards science. itself. Do you think that social media is potentially playing a role? And if not, or even if so, what are some other factors that might be contributing to this?
Yeah. So let me just confirm and double down on what you're saying. We have lost faith in basically every institution that we can imagine: education, science, medicine, media, government, and corporations, right? And you could say, hey, some of those deserve our mistrust, and that's fine.
Absolutely.
That's fine. But when we lose that type of trust, that social trust, especially not only in institutions, but in each other, we lose basically the force that bonds us as a culture. What allows us to get anything done together as a society is social capital, the belief that people can depend on one another, at least at some level. So you lose that, you stall society's engine, basically. So even though it might be understandable, it's deeply harmful. So why does that happen? You asked about social media. I mean, the thing is that when two trends co-occur in time, it doesn't mean that one caused the other, and it's hard to causally explain why something has changed over the course of history. That said, it is also clearly true that the rise of social media has corresponded with a huge cratering of our faith in institutions and in each other. It's also true that the more time people spend on social media as individuals, the more that they tend to mistrust, the worse that they think people are, and the worse that they think the world and the future will be. And then finally, if you give people a social media fast, if you force them to disconnect for a period of a few weeks, they oftentimes report being mentally healthier. And part of that connects to their, detachment from social media's, gasoline on the fire of our negativity bias.
People are also becoming more cynical towards relationships themselves, ironically. But, maybe in part due to certain feminist ideas, but marriage is something that I think has become. We are now starting to look more cynically towards marriage, and the whole trad movement online is seen as being like a fringe movement. When it's if anything, it's a call to return to a family unit, which, if anything, I mean, the fad is that we don't need that unit, right? In the evolutionary and historical timescale of humanity.
One of the antidotes to cynicism, and we can get into many more, is devotion. This idea of giving ourselves over to other people, to a role of service, whether it's to love or to family or to society. I think that right now we are wrapped in an intensely consumerist and sort of pleasure-seeking version of ourselves. And there's reasons for that. I mean, media has also encouraged us to view ourselves as consumers more than as givers, right? To think about what we can take, the value that we can extract from life. And again, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with being a consumer in certain moments, in certain parts of our life. But love and relationships, in my opinion, is not one of those spaces where it's healthy. I mean, I think you're right about sort of changing opinions on marriage. I would also add that relationships have become gamified. I mean, I'm lucky. I take myself to be lucky that I was paired off before dating apps ever arrived on the scene. But I can only imagine how it would feel to have an endless flow of people with whom I could connect, designed on an app on my phone that's created to be just like a casino, to give me unpredictable rewards and to make me feel like there's always maybe something better on the horizon. That to me, again, this is no shade on people who have met the love of their life on dating apps or people who are just enjoying them. To each their own. But in my opinion, oftentimes that approach to love, that consumerist approach to love, can undercut the very core of what we're trying to find or what we might try to find in relationships.
100%. What are some signs that somebody might be becoming more cynical?
Well, there's a famous questionnaire called the Cook-Medley Hostility Scale.
The Cook-Medley Hostility Scale.
Yeah, designed by two psychologists, Walter Cook and Donald Medley, in the 1950s. They wanted to examine teachers and predict which teachers would get along with their students and which ones wouldn't. So they asked teachers to answer 50 yes or no questions. And it was things like, people are honest chiefly through fear of getting caught. or people don't really like helping one another. These were not questions about what people do, but rather about their motives. And they found that teachers who answered these gloomy questions affirmatively, who said, yes, people are honest chiefly through fear of getting caught, they got along with their students a lot less well. They also got along with their friends and family less well. They also mistrusted government and other institutions. And Cook and Medley said, shoot, this is not just a test for teachers, this is a test for people. So it's available online. People can test themselves. But another sign, not just what you say, but what you do can signal your cynicism as well. And the primary form here is our willingness to be vulnerable to other people. Cynics think that trust is a sucker's bet. They imagine that when you take a chance on somebody else, then you'll probably be betrayed. They'll take advantage of you. You're gullible. You're a rube. Less cynical people are more open to giving others a chance to show us who they are.
Wow. Trust is so important. I mean, being able to trust and express vulnerability, I think, is a superpower. And I couldn't agree more. So if someone were to get the sense that they were becoming, well, is that even something that's easy to observe? Like sometimes I feel like it's difficult to take a meta view of oneself. So you're saying that this test is something that can help, but are there any other subjective ways? I mean, I would imagine that cynicism correlates with, or maybe it doesn't, worse mental health outcomes. I mean, if somebody is feeling gloomy, experiences undue depression, anxiety, might that be an indicator that they're also perhaps taking a more cynical worldview?
Absolutely. So a couple of points here. One, you are 100% right that cynicism is deeply unhealthy at virtually every level scientists can measure. Cynics tend to suffer from more depression and loneliness, but also more cellular inflammation, heart disease, and earlier mortality. There are a ton of prospective studies with large cohorts that find that people who report being cynical are more likely to die in the subsequent 10, 20, 30 years. And I know that sounds strange. How could a worldview affect your heart health? But I think it makes sense when you consider it more deeply. There's one study that I find really fascinating and really sad. People were brought into the lab and asked to give an extemporaneous speech on a topic they didn't know to a harsh audience of judges. Not something that most people want to do, and it increases our blood pressure. Half of these people had a cheerleader, not a literal, but they had a stranger who was there I'm in your corner, you can do this, just being friendly and warm and supportive. And half didn't. And it turned out that if you are not a cynic, having a supportive person around lowered your blood pressure. It buffered you from the stress of this difficult task. But for cynics, it didn't matter if someone was there or not. Their blood pressure was high either way. It's like cynicism stops us from being able to consume or metabolize the nourishment of social life, the calories of social life. And so with that in mind, I think you're exactly right. A lot of people don't go to therapists and say, I'm too cynical. A lot of people are proud of their cynicism. Instead, they go to therapists and they say, I feel depressed. I feel lonely. I feel disconnected. And it's only then that they discover cynicism as a hidden cause of those forms of pain.
So is cynicism universally bad? I mean, it's like, it doesn't seem helpful. Are there any instances where cynicism might be adaptive?
I'm trying not to use black and white language, but I'm tempted to almost go there here, because I think that any example that people give me of useful cynicism is actually skepticism. It's absolutely useful to not trust people if they've hurt you in the past. It's absolutely wise to not trust what a politician says if they've lied in the past. It would be ridiculous to trust the people playing high-stakes poker against you to be accurately representing their hand. Right? It's 100% reasonable to be mistrustful in cases. But cynicism, this blanket assumption about everybody, is actually quite a terrible strategy, not just for connecting and feeling healthy and happy, but for learning about the world, for being accurate and wise.
Yeah, it's almost like it's a maladaptive distrust of, it's like a maladaptive trusting of yourself that previous experiences are, somehow a guarantee of present and future experiences.
Yes, I love the way that you're putting that, Max. And, another way of thinking about it is that cynics have no faith in people, but they have lots of faith in their assumptions, right? Cynicism can be a cold but cozy experience because you already know people before you even meet them. And I think that confidence that cynics have can be addictive, right? Even if your conclusions are gloomy, if you are sure of them, then you know the world, and that feels like a form of power. And it's very difficult to let that go and be humble about what you don't know instead.
Is there any data on cynicism as it pertains to personal and professional success?
Yes, a lot. And it turns out that we, as a culture, are dead wrong about cynicism. We valorize it. I'd say that we have put it on a pedestal, and it's hurting us further. One example of this is what's known as the cynical genius illusion.
The cynical genius illusion.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite studies. Researchers presented people with stories about one person who's deeply cynical and another who's trusting and open-minded. And they said, who do you think would be better at these different tasks? 70% of people claimed that the cynic would be smarter than the non-cynic. 85% thought that a cynic would be socially smarter. For instance, better able to detect who's lying and who's telling the truth. And it turns out that most people are wrong. Data demonstrate that cynics do less well on cognitive tests than non-cynics, and they're worse at lie detection. Again, if we wrap ourselves up in our assumptions, we stop paying attention to the evidence. And so it actually turns out to be a really unwise and naive way to move through the world. And then second, to your question about success in the workplace, there's also evidence there that finds that cynics want power at work more than non-cynics, but they achieve it less. They're they earn less money over the course of their careers, and they're less likely to rise to leadership positions. Now, why is that? Well, cynics, it turns out, have a backwards view of what success is. They imagine that their workplace, for instance, is a Darwinian battle royale, and they need to just step on everybody in order to achieve success. But as you know, success actually has to do with our ability to build coalitions and to collaborate. So cynics, in that way, want success, but pursue it in almost an exactly backwards way.
Wow. Yeah, collaboration is so important to success. I mean, for example, like this podcast is a successful podcast, and people might attribute its success solely to me, but I'm but one cog in this, this endeavor now, which involves Sydney, my producer. It involves, my video editors for my YouTube channel. And so, yeah, it's crucially important to be able to delegate, to be able to work alongside others, to be able to trust, that others are going to be able to do a good job. So I love this, underscoring of how important collaboration is.
And in collaborations, it turns out that trust doesn't just allow us to work together, it changes people for the better. One of the most important things that I learned in doing research for this book is about self-fulfilling prophecies. People are such a reciprocal species. We give to others what they give to us. We become the people that they expect us to be. And so if you're cynical, you might, for instance, not you, of course, Max, but one might micromanage the people on their team, monitor what they're doing, ensure that everybody's on task all the time. Well, sure, maybe if you do that, people will meet the bare minimum of what you're forcing them to do. But they'll also feel your mistrust. They'll mistrust you right back, and they're much less likely to go above and beyond. When people trust others, when we put faith in them, then it turns out that they step up to meet those expectations. Economists call that earned trust. So we can, through our cynicism, create these toxic self-fulfilling prophecies where we bring out the very parts of people that we fear. But if we are courageous enough, open-minded enough to trust instead, and I would say to trust loudly, to tell people, hey, I have faith in you. This is why I'm giving you this important task. Then it's much more likely that they become who we hope they'll be.
I love that. That's super actionable. So on that point, are there any other tools, tactics to make collaborations more productive?
Yes. So one is to think about the structures that we're creating for collaborations. So in one person that I learned a lot about and have lots of opinions on is Jack Welch, the CEO of GE. He was this famous. He was declared the executive of the century around the year 2000, right, for the 1900s, and he was a ruthless leader. And one of his tactics was known as stack ranking. So he would say, no matter what, no matter how everybody does, I'm going to fire the bottom 10% of GE every year. And his idea was this will motivate people because people are selfish. And so this will create a survival of the fittest situation.
Like a dog eats dog.
Exactly.
Mentality.
Nature red in tooth and claw. So Welch here was a Darwinist, or at least he thought he was. What he didn't realize, but what Charles Darwin did realize, is that fitness isn't just a quality of individuals, it's a quality of groups as well. And so if you have a group of people who are working together, whose outcomes are tied to one another, they will be more fit than a group of people, even strong individuals, clawing each other all day long. So how can we make that practical? We can basically try to be the anti-Jack Welch. Instead of pitting people against each other, can we create incentive structures where people can succeed best by working together? One way that I like to think about this is, can we reward people for the ways that they make others better? You know, I love the NBA, and one of my favorite players is Chris Paul. You know, the point guard, he's a great point guard. And one of the things about him is that every time he joined a new team, for a dozen years, he was on 4 different teams. And within 2 years of him joining a team, that team had its best record in history. And the reason is because he helps other people score. So I think that a great thing for leaders and managers is to see if you can identify your Chris Pauls. Can you elevate, celebrate, and reward people not just for what they do, but for the ways that they show up for one another?
Ooh, I love that. Are there any ways to cultivate skepticism when one finds himself slipping into a more cynical mindset?
Yeah. So we talked about how oftentimes cynics will go to therapy because they're depressed, not because they're cynical. But it turns out some of the tools we use to treat depression and anxiety can be super helpful for cynicism as well. The most successful therapy for those mood disorders is cognitive behavioral therapy, which in essence challenges patients. A therapist and a patient will collaborate and say, okay, you've got this black and white view of the world. You think you're worthless. You think everybody hates you. Well, let's validate that feeling, right? You feel that way. You're not wrong necessarily to feel that way, but your feeling doesn't necessarily represent the truth. Your depression is not necessarily right. So how can we test it? Well, if you were a scientist and your hypothesis was, I'm worthless, what data do you have to support that? It's a pretty big hypothesis, so you better have a lot of data. And patients will often say, well, I don't know, I just kind of feel that way. But again, a feeling is not the same as a fact. So let's go hunting for some better data. For instance, if you ask 5 of your friends to go to the movies and all of them just say no with no excuse, well, maybe they really don't like you as much. But if even one person says yes, well, then maybe you need to reconsider what you are thinking, your bleak black and white perspective. The same goes for cynics. If you find yourself suspecting somebody who you just met, or coming up with a blanket conclusion about everybody in a certain industry, for instance, you can fact check that cynical feeling. You can say, wait a minute, what is my evidence here? And if I don't have good enough evidence, how could I get it?
What about exercise? I mean, on days when I'm feeling particularly cynical about the world, pessimistic, I know that having a good workout completely reorients my frame of mind, my worldview, and I'm a different person walking out of the gym than I was walking into it. Is there any data on that?
Yes. So I think there are, insofar as cynicism is a symptom of stress and burnout. One of the best ways to lower somebody's ability to empathize and increase their willingness to judge other people is to freak them out, to put them in a state of threat. I think so many of us are walking around in a chronic state of threat these days. And when you feel threatened, your negativity bias goes through the roof. For me, running is the antidote for that, right? I always tell my wife, I need to go running today because it's the button that I press to lower my cortisol levels. Right? And when we can enter a state of physiological calm, greater abundance, it naturally allows us to disconnect from that cynicism and meet people where they are.
Do we know anything about the mechanism there? I mean, how does exercise help so effectively?
Well, I think that generally speaking, exercise is a good way of lowering our stress hormones, right? In essence, we used to be stressed 100,000 years ago because we had to do something. We had to fight somebody. We had to run away. There was work to be done. But now we sit here and stress about a deadline that is 3 months away, but seems like it will take 4 months of work to achieve. That's not actionable. And so we end up in this hormonal and physiological state that requires physical work, but we're not putting it in. That's where chronic stress comes from. So to me, exercise is a release of that stress. It's basically saying, okay, body, you want to do something, let's do something. And once your body is able to get through that activity, stress hormones naturally decline.
Wow. Talk to us about your background. Why is this a topic that you have come to focus on in your work?
Yeah, so I've been studying kindness, compassion, empathy, and connection for 20 years. And there's this stereotype that research is me-search, that whatever you do, you must be that. And so for 20 years, people have assumed that I must be the rosiest, most positive, blissed out person. And it's just not true. You know, Max, I came from a pretty difficult family background. My parents had a terrible relationship with one another. And I ended up insecurely attached. We were talking about how attachment style relates to our willingness to trust other people. And as long as I can remember, I've had a hard time trusting other people, an easy time judging and suspecting people. And it just felt like this rift between what I do for a living, the science that I know to be true, and my own feelings. And that started to frustrate me. And especially during the early pandemic, when I was just living off of screens, I felt this enormous disconnection between the person I wanted to be and who I was. And I thought, gosh, if I, a kindness scientist, am being swallowed alive by cynicism, how's it going for everybody else? And so I started working on this topic and writing this book because it's the thing I needed. And it turned out, at least it seems to me, lots of people need it as well.
What's something that you think we all need to know about kindness?
A lot. One thing that I would say is that being kind to others is one of the fastest ways to serve ourselves. You know, people need not just fulfillment in a consumerist sense. We need fulfillment in terms of having a sense of purpose. And one of the things that I firmly believe we are on earth to do is to help one another, to work together, to do things that we could never do alone through cooperation. I mean, that's just the fundamental nature of our species. If you look at us, we're not that fast. We're not that strong. We can't swim very well. We certainly can't fly. What sets us apart is our ability to work together. So when you act kindly, you are tapping into the fundamental purpose of humanity. And unsurprisingly, if you think that way, when people act kindly, their stress decreases, their sense of loneliness decreases, their sense of happiness and satisfaction with life increases. It's almost as though doing for others is one of the best things that we can do for ourselves.
It's interesting. It does feel like it's a uniquely human characteristic. Is there evidence that other animals display kindness to one another?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So the most famous work here is done by the late, great primatologist Frans de Waal, who studied chimpanzees. And he documented incredibly complex, long-standing relationships between these animals, and also ways that they would try to console one another. So he's got these famous observations of chimpanzees getting in fights, and these are brutal fights in many cases with severe injuries. And the chimpanzee, I'm already anthropomorphizing here, the chimpanzee who loses the fight will often be surrounded by their friends. I mean, I hesitate to use the term friends, but these are the other animals that are grooming during peaceful times, that are grooming each other and just hanging out. And they'll embrace the loser of the conflict and try to comfort them. This sort of fundamental act of kindness.
It's so cool. Yeah, I mean, I guess when my cat is grooming me, licking me, she is expressing a kindness towards me. It's super cute. And yeah, it is. it is interesting that you do get that dopamine spike from being kind to somebody else, which doesn't, I guess, make intuitive sense, but it it's a really fulfilling act to just express kindness for no personal gain other than just, than to do a kindness.
I loved your episode with Arthur Brooks, and I found a lot of value in something that you said there when you said that there's earned dopamine and unearned dopamine, and our culture is just flush with unearned dopamine, ways that you can just get hits of pleasure for nothing, many of them on our phones or screens. Kindness is, I would say, the quintessential form of earned dopamine.
You're right. Wow. I'm glad that resonated with you because, I've been kind of noodling on that for some time, and I think it's a great framework with which to cultivate an appreciation of oneself and to boost self-esteem, and then also to create sustainable, healthy habits.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's a difference between hedonic pleasure and satisfaction. And I think that when we confuse happiness with just one thing, we end up seeking out hedonism. But satisfaction is the experience of having struggled and then achieved. And so a lot of people think of kindness, it can be surprising, right? If somebody is depressed, they just want to stay home. They want to focus on themselves. And that's what their brain is telling them. It's not their fault. That's what their brain is telling them to do. If you're lonely, it turns out that research finds that you focus more on what you need. The surprising solution in many cases, not all, is just go and volunteer. Just go and help somebody else. And it's the last thing that comes to mind if you're in a cycle of need and scarcity. But when you give to others, you put yourself in a state of abundance instead. And so, again, it's this earned dopamine that flushes out the unearned types that we might crave, but that might not help us in the long run.
I wonder if is that a concept that has any academic analog, or is that, because I feel like maybe it's some emergent concept that I came up with, after listening to other experts and looking into the, just my own perusal of the literature. But it seems like, I don't know. It just seems like an interesting framework.
Well, I think that one thing that earned dopamine fights against is hedonic adaptation.
Yeah.
Right? The thing about the dopamine system that is both cool and terrifying is that we can get used to almost anything, right? So you get dopamine for things that are surprisingly good, but it's impossible to be surprised by how good something is continuously, especially if it's the same thing, and especially if all you have to do is press a button for it. This is where drug tolerance comes from.
Yes.
This is where tolerance to wealth comes from, right? I mean, people think that they would be twice as happy with twice as much money, but the fact is that when you have twice as much money, you get used to the luxuries that affords you, and you stop enjoying them, right? So I think that one piece that, and again, I'm not saying this is conclusive, but if I'm trying to find a connection to the academic work with this cool idea of earned dopamine, it's that effort fights against hedonic adaptation. Because if you're working for something, then it's sort of the amount that it's surprising and pleasant can intensify.
Totally. I think that hedonic adaptation is one of the it is one of the worst parts of the human condition. That, it's just how difficult it is to maintain an appreciative relationship with something that's always around.
That's true. Can I push back just a little bit?
Yeah, of course.
Hedonic adaptation is also at the heart of resilience. Because it's not just for when things are going well. When we are struggling, when we're facing long-term adversity, we also adapt to that. And, think about a chronic illness, right? If you have a chronic illness, the first experiences of those symptoms are so disheartening. Now, of course, having them last longer is worse, right? I mean, we'd all prefer to be sick for just a little while. But people with chronic illnesses, people who lose limbs, people who lose their life savings, they adapt. They find ways to bounce back and be resilient. And part of that is because of hedonic adaptation. So I would say it cuts both ways.
Yeah, it's like, thank God you adapt in certain circumstances, right?
Exactly.
As a way to mitigate suffering.
Yes.
In some obvious circumstances that for many are unavoidable.
Yeah.
Is there a way to reframe negative thoughts when we're experiencing them? A way to stop, essentially, negative thoughts?
Yes, I mean, there are many. The most famous is what's known as reappraisal, which is understanding. It's an idea, that connects with the philosophy of Stoicism as well, right? It's the idea that, well, an event has occurred, and that's out of my hands. But what is absolutely within my power is my interpretation of that event, the narratives that I tell about it. So which narratives do I want to go with? And just understanding that your stories are not the same as what's happening outside, and that you have deep control over your stories. It's kind of a surprising thing for people, because we're used to just saying, oh, something bad happened, I want to feel terrible about it. I think there's almost a craving for negative emotions sometimes, right? We don't want to get out of our sadness because we feel that it allows us to stop doing things, right? If I say, oh, well, I tried that and I failed and I suck and everything is terrible, well, that absolves me of responsibility for moving forward. So it takes work to take control over your narratives, but that's a really powerful way to change your brain, your body, and your mind's response to difficult emotions and experiences.
Yeah, sometimes negativity, sadness can also be a really powerful battery, a well of energy from which to draw from. I mean, I know that my best work was created as a result of, the fact that I had real sickness in my life. My mom had a chronic illness for many years and passed away, and it was really tragic and awful. And it's what's motivated my life's work. And I know that for many artists, some of their best art is created early on in their career before they've reached commercial success, because of the weight that they feel on their shoulders.
And I think that there's this literature on post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that's very well known. There's a less known scientific body of work on post-traumatic growth. The idea that oftentimes our hardest moments bring out the best in us, as you're saying, right? And oftentimes that comes from our ability to reinterpret and re-narrativize our difficulties, and also from our sense of community in the face of those difficulties. We were talking about kindness earlier and how it's fundamentally human. It also turns out that kindness is one of the most powerful tools we have during difficult times. I'll give you an example. So let's say, and you mind if I'll quiz you on something really quick? Yeah. So I want to ask you whether you think that the pandemic increased or decreased kindness around the world. So let's say, compared to the years before, 2017 to 19, do you think that kindness around the world during 2020 to 2022 was higher, lower, or around the same?
Wow, that's a tough question. I want to say that it was lower because people were so frustrated, so agitated.
Yeah.
And so stressed out. I mean, we know that sales of alcohol went up during the pandemic. Like, there was a lot of stress.
100%. That's what I thought too. In fact, I surveyed 1,000 Americans and asked them the same question. More than half thought that kindness had gone down. Barely 20% thought that it had gone up. And you're right. There was so much stress, alcohol sales, as you're saying. Also, you remember news stories of like people fighting each other in grocery stores over toilet paper? It felt like we had just gone feral, like we were all lost. It turns out there are great data on this from something known as the World Happiness Report, which has been collecting data on donations to charity, volunteering, and helping strangers around the world for many years. And the pandemic was one of the greatest events to increase global kindness in the entire time that they've been collecting that survey. And so it turns out that during our hardest times, during even potentially traumatic times, we react not by falling apart, but by coming together, by helping one another, by tapping into that well of kindness. And that to me is beautiful as a statement on our species, right? Because disasters reveal our true colors. And you think Lord of the Flies. You think when disaster strikes, people will tear each other apart. The opposite is true. But it's also deeply sad, because here was this global avalanche of kindness, and most people never even noticed. In fact, we thought the opposite was that. You and I both thought that the opposite had happened. So how are we so wrong about each other, and how can we become a little bit less wrong?
Yeah. Wow. That's super interesting. It's crazy. The World Happiness Report has yielded some really interesting data. I haven't read the report, but I am familiar with some data to have come from it. And the U.S. slipped down to its, I believe it's the lowest level the U.S. has ever been in terms of per capita happiness. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's very complicated. And my lab actually will be contributing a chapter to the 2025 World Happiness Report.
Wow,
so
cool.
we think a lot about this. I think there's many reasons. You can easily point to technology. You can easily point to changes in the way that we are living our social lives, changes in relationship structures that you've talked about. I do think that cynicism is a sneaky contributor to lower happiness, especially among young people. Because when we feel cynical about others, when we underestimate their values, we don't take chances on them and we end up lonelier. We found this at Stanford. So my lab surveyed thousands of Stanford undergraduates recently, and we asked about themselves and the average Stanford student. For instance, how much would you like to help somebody who's down? And how much do you think the average Stanford student would want to help somebody? How much would you like to connect with new friends on campus? How much do you think the average Stanford student would? And we discovered not one, but two Stanfords. One was made up of real students, and it was enormously warm. I mean, these students are off scale on empathy and on their desire to make new friends. The second Stanford lived inside their minds, and it was colder and pricklier. These are freshmen who just got to campus, but they assume that their average peer is far less friendly and empathic than they really are. They're cynical, in other words, about their peers. And those students who most underestimated their peers ended up less connected and lonelier over the next 6 months. So we think a lot these days about loneliness and disconnection as a source of unhappiness in the US, especially among young people. But oftentimes I think that reflects a misunderstanding about each other, a sense that, hey, if I were to try to connect with somebody, they wouldn't be there for me. When in fact, people desperately want to be there for each other. And it's this tragic state of affairs because it's so preventable. I mean, I think about my own students, and I love my students. They're wonderful people. Many of them desperate for connection, not realizing that everybody else around them wants to connect as well. It's like they're starving in the middle of an organic grocery store.
Wow, what a metaphor. Do you think that, I mean, as we record this, we're about 3 weeks away from the election here in the United States. Do you feel like the government and maybe and the media are in any way complicit in the growing levels of cynicism nationally? I mean, you have each side of the political aisle essentially sowing distrust for the other side, which, represents roughly 50% of the US population.
Yeah, I think it's really terrible, and it's unnecessary, and it's harmful. I mean, let's also stipulate that those politicians are aided and abetted by media companies that profit off of negativity bias, that profit by keeping us online, by just giving us whatever we fear and loathe most. But you're absolutely right that we've entered this incredibly black and white moment in politics. And it's not just increasing the amount that we hate one another and decreasing the amount that we can work together. It's also decreasing our accuracy about the other side. So my friend and colleague Rob Willer and many other psychologists have asked people on either side, Republicans and Democrats, what do you think the average person that you disagree with is like? And it turns out that on both sides, if you're asked what's the average Republican and you're a Democrat, you say that they're more extreme than 80% of actual Republicans. And the same goes if you're a Republican asked about a Democrat. We imagine that the people we disagree with are extremists. We think that they are twice as hateful, twice as anti-democratic, and 4 times as violent as they really are. And again, this all fed by politicians who are giving us those grotesque representations of the other side and a media ecosystem that's also helping with that process. We, at the same time, have stopped having conversations with real people we disagree with. So we are relegated to 2-dimensional representations of whoever's on the other side that are toxic. But again, I want to just hit this point hard. Wrong. We are just wrong. And if we could be more accurate, we would discover immense amounts of common ground. But I don't know that discovery would be helpful to politicians or to media companies.
Do you think that politicians and the media have a responsibility to paint a more charitable picture of their opponents?
how to not sound cynical here, Max. I am here to help with anti-cynicism, but look, I mean, I think that, let's talk about media companies for one, right? I think that there are great people at media and social media companies. Every single company has wonderful people in it. I think that there are lots of people there whose mission is to help people be informed and healthy and connected. But I just think that right now the profit motive is cutting against that. I think that there are lots of ways that we could create more accurate, more balanced feeds. Lots of ways that we could promote deeper dialogue between people who are different from one another. But I just don't know. I just don't know that's what people are interested in at a bottom line level who are at those companies. I just, for instance, if politicians were to help us understand what we have in common, a lot of what we have in common is that we think politicians should be funded less, for instance, right? But which politician is going to want us to find that common ground? So I think that here is a case of self-interest cutting against responsibility. I do think that politicians especially, I'm not going to speak for private companies, but I think politicians, if they consider themselves public servants, do have a responsibility to help us see each other more clearly, to help us find hope. But I just don't think that that's in their personal interest right now.
Yeah, and also in many ways they're just feeding what they feel that the population wants to see, and they have data to back that. They know what people are clicking on these news sites, and they know and on social media, and they know what people are tuning into to watch, on the nightly news.
It's sad though, because to get back to the dopamine system, the great scientist Kent Berridge talked about wanting and liking. So wanting is the thing that a rat will press a button over and over again until it dies in order to get cocaine and other stimulants, for instance. Liking are things that the rat actually seems to find pleasant. It's more associated with the opioid system in the brain, actually. And oftentimes, what we want and what we like are totally different. I don't know if you've experienced this, but sometimes I feel like I really want something and I don't like the way that I want it.
Yeah.
It feels too grabby. It feels too much like a hunger that I can't satiate. I think that politicians might be right that people, quote unquote, want bad news. They want these horrible representations of the other side, but that doesn't mean that people like it. People hate it. 80% or more of Americans wish that we were less divided. We trust each other less than we used to, but 79% of Americans wish we trusted each other more. So we're in a state of affairs where we're seeking safety. We're seeking confirmation for the things that we fear. But that's not actually what we want our culture to be like. There's a super majority of us who want something, who would like something different. But it's clashing with our older brains, I suppose.
Maybe it's that we want things to satisfy. What we want satisfies more our id, like our pleasure seeking.
Yes.
The pleasure seeking side of ourselves. And what is the super ego is like the more calculating, rational.
Yeah.
I don't actually remember.
It's the super ego is the representation of what society wants for you. The ego is the arbiter between those. How can I get what I want while doing so in a socially responsible way?
Wow. What role does gratitude play in countering cynicism and negativity bias?
It plays a huge role. I mean, generally speaking, because of negativity bias, we are just wrong about other people. And, I've now spent 4 years marinating in the science of cynicism. You might think that would have made me gloomier, especially given my starting point was pretty cynical. The opposite has happened. I feel much more hopeful because when you look at the data, it turns out that people in general are more trustworthy, more generous, more open-minded, and friendlier than we realize they are. That's not to say there aren't toxic folks out there or people doing great harm, but the average person underestimates the average person. So being hopeful then is a matter of trying to be more accurate. Gratitude is one way of doing that, right? It forces you to document the things that people are doing that are good, right? It forces you to balance your own bias. I would promote, in addition to gratitude, another practice known as savoring.
Savoring?
Yeah. So gratitude is remembering good things after they've happened. Savoring is noticing good things while they happen and sitting in that moment, being mindful and present while something that makes you happy occurs. My kids and I do this all the time. Like we'll do ice cream eating classes where we'll just sit and eat ice cream. And I'll say, well, what do you like about this? Is it the flavor? Is it the texture? What do you want to remember about this moment? So it's really paying close attention to the goodness in life. And it turns out that when you do that, a lot of the goodness that we experience is from other people. You know, I feel as though there are so many people doing good all the time. Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers famously said, when there's something scary happening, look for the helpers. And there are helpers everywhere. But negativity bias kind of puts blinders on us so that we miss out on all the positive and kind and friendly and wonderful things that people do. So to me, a practice of savoring is sort of opening the aperture, being ready to take that information in and receive it. And I think that can be a great tool for balancing out negativity bias.
Super helpful. Yeah, I think it's really mindfulness about the present moment. As a way to appreciate what you've got in front of you. That's really, I think, powerful advice. Where are you heading next with your research? I mean, what's next for you? What are some, what future direction do you think this research might go? What excites you about the future of your research, the research on cynicism and negativity?
Yeah.
Etc.
So let me start with the future of my work on fighting negativity bias and cynicism. Again, the good news for me is that cynicism comes so easily when we have too little information. And it's much better, right? We are naturally more hopeful when we're more accurate, when we have better data. So I'm trying to help people collect better data. I told you about this case at Stanford where students underestimated one another and that made them lonelier or left them lonelier. We started a campaign last year where we targeted certain dorms where freshmen live. And we did an ad campaign where the target audience was Stanford undergraduates and the product was also Stanford undergraduates. We put posters around these dorms that just presented students with the real data. 95% of the people around you want to help folks who are down. 85% of your peers want to meet new friends on campus. And we further did a sort of educational program where we taught them about these data. And we found that students in those dorms, compared to dorms that didn't receive this information, were more accurate about their peers, less likely to underestimate them. They took more risks, striking up more conversations with strangers, opening up to their roommates. And they ended up with more friends in the subsequent 6 months. And the great thing is we didn't have to lie to them. We just had to tell them the truth. Likewise, I told you about how we have these horrible perceptions of people we disagree with because we're not actually talking to them. In my lab, we brought people together, Republicans and Democrats, for Zoom conversations about gun control, abortion, and climate change. These are not easy issues to talk about. We asked them to predict, how do you think this conversation will go and how will you feel afterwards? And they said, well, somewhere between neutral and horrible. They thought it would be unproductive at best and harmful at worst, that they would feel worse about the other side. We then, after they had these conversations, asked them to rate how well it went on a 1 to 100 scale, where 1 was absolutely horrible and 100 was absolutely wonderful. And the most common response we got was a 100 out of 100. People loved these conversations, and they were shocked by how much they loved them. They were shocked that somebody they disagreed with actually could be normal, could be a person who has their own story and their own concerns. And that decreased their hatred for the other side as well. So I think that a big mission of my work right now is just helping people be more informed about people. Because when we seek the truth, instead of relying on our assumptions, pleasant surprises are everywhere.
Well, we got to get you in the door at these social media companies. Because social media apps, I mean, all they do is they create these echo chambers based on what, they just play into the confirmation bias of whatever kind of content you seek out. And that's what they fill your Explore page or your For You feed with.
Absolutely.
And I think there's probably so much utility in getting this message out to, these companies so that maybe they will consider surfacing some content from the other side.
Yeah. I mean, I think that would be wonderful because right now, what we see from the other side is just people dunking on each other and quote tweeting one another and the most toxic stuff that you can imagine. Mm-hmm. What if instead we had people present their views on issues, right? So I'll give you one example. immigration, this super contentious issue. If you ask Republicans and Democrats, what do you want, where 0 is a totally closed border and 100 is a totally open border? Yeah, they disagree, but their disagreements look like two hills that are deeply connected, right? Democrats want a little bit more openness, Republicans a little bit more closure, but most people are somewhere in the middle, right? They're two overlapping hills. But then if you ask Democrats, what do you think Republicans want? And you ask Republicans, what do you think Democrats want? In our minds, the other side is at 0 or 100. We see no common ground, even though there's tons. So if social media platforms wanted to, they could be a source for accurate information. They could shed a light on our common values and our common goals instead of what splits us apart. Now, again, whether that would conflict with their profit motive, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I'm not an economist of social media, but that would add to their value in serving society and in serving the truth.
Totally. I mean, I find value. I bring on people onto the show all the time who I might not necessarily agree with on every point, but I get value in seeing what the quote unquote other side is, what they have to offer, their perspective, the data that they're bringing to the table. I think it would be super useful for others to do the same, particularly with these kinds of topics that where the other side so often gets strawmanned into an argument that's not really the argument that they're making.
One of my least favorite new terms to pop up recently is platforming. Because it seems now that not only do we have this terrible representation of the other side, but doing what you do, bringing on people who you disagree with, giving them voice, listening to them, I think that should be viewed as extremely admirable. But I think in some spaces it's viewed as the opposite. Like, you're platforming this person. You're giving voice to these ideas that have no place in polite society. Well, yes, of course, maybe there are certain voices that we don't need to amplify more. But overall, I think it's great to hear as many opinions as we can. And that diversity of opinions can also help us realize that people we disagree with are not generally bloodthirsty lunatics. But there's almost been this sense that listening to the other side is a crime against your own. And I think that just solidifies and cements some of the worst parts of our culture.
Yeah, as long as they're not pathological people, as long as they are people that seem to express empathy, that express open-mindedness, curiosity, they're not cynics themselves, they're not cynical to your argument.
Yes.
I think that's a really good person from whom to tease out whatever kernel of truth, there is to be found in their argument.
Yeah. And if you listen to other people, they're much more likely to listen to you as well. And political scientists find that one of the most powerful tools for persuasion is empathic and personal conversations. That's not to say that you will change somebody's mind entirely, but if you listen to them, if you ask for their experience, again, we as a reciprocal species, they're going to ask for yours as well. And they might see value in what you are sharing, just like you see value in what they share.
Absolutely. Well, this was super interesting. Thanks so much for coming in.
This has been delightful, Max.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you having me on.
Of course. Where can listeners learn more from you? Where can they find you on social media? And where can they buy your new book?
Yeah, so Hope for Cynics is available wherever books are. I read the audio version if people like to consume books that way. My lab, the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab, is at ssnl.stanford.edu. I'm at jamil-zaki.com, and I'm Zaki Jam on a couple of different social platforms.
Love it. Well, the last question that gets asked to everybody on the show, what does living a genius life mean to you?
I love this question, and I've thought about it. I think that I go to one of my favorite writers, the monk and nun, Pema Chodron. She said, we can treat our lives less like a plan and more like an experiment. We can stop the usual flow of thoughts and be open to the world as it arrives to us. I think that a genius life is an open-minded, curious, and humble life, one where we are able to courageously set aside our assumptions about ourselves, each other, and the world, and let the world come to us instead.
Beautifully put. Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.